Okay, I'm going to go ahead and get us started for our workshop today. My name is Katie Overmeyer. I'm a member of Joshua Kuhn's research group at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. This workshop that we're providing is through the support of the NIH and our National Center. The name of our center is the National Center for Quantitative Biology of Complex Systems. That is probably how you registered for today. If you're curious, it's going to have the screen come up. You can also go to our website, NQBCS.com. We will have continued trainings going forward. We also do a yearly mass spec summer school, which I think is really great. If you haven't had the opportunity to join, it's a good time. But the workshop today, just to give you a little bit of an overview, we have technologies associated with our national center that we've been developing here surrounding lipidomics technologies. So acquisition methods, nanoflow lipidomics, real-time library searching for acquisition. We also have a software tool for data processing and lipid identifications, and that will be going over on day 2. Today we'll focus mostly on acquisition methodologies we've been developing in-house. Our goal with this workshop is it's very interactive. Feel free to turn on your video, ask questions. We will also have you ask questions in the chat during the lectures and try to get those addressed at the moment it feels appropriate to do so. And as we have breakout sessions for demos, definitely feel free to ask and interrupt during those. Our goal is to help you guys get lipidomics set up and going in your lab, or to be able to take advantage of these technologies we've been working on. So yes, today we'll go up through 5 o'clock. We'll start with Yuchen and Dain talking about chromatography and MS acquisition. We'll have demo and then a short break. And Alan Sagittilian will give a research lecture, which I'm sure will be very excellent. And follow up with a Q&A session. Any dying questions you have at the end of the day, that's your opportunity. And then tomorrow we're going to start at 9 a.m. Central Time. Judy Simcox will be giving a research lecture, and then Paul Hutchins, who developed Lipidex, will be giving a lecture about our lipidomics analysis pipeline. Ben will be giving our demo. And then in the afternoon, we'll be going over data quality control metrics that you should evaluate, as well as data analysis tools, and then building out a lipidomics library. So really excited to get this going. The team here, I've called out all their names. The only one I'm missing is Laura Van Tol, which you probably got emails from. And she's been really helpful in administrating all of the Zoom and workshop logistics. So thank you all for coming. And enjoy. Yuchen, whenever you want to start sharing your screen, you're good.
Okay, can you hear me well? Yes. Okay, so today so me and Dain will going to talk about some kind of basic ideas of chromatography and MS data acquisition. And I will go ahead and start with some kind of very basic ideas of chromatography for lipidomics. So just to start with some definitions. So what are lipids? There are kind of different definitions if you just like search online, and I kind of picked 2 of them and put them here because they are sort of like representative. And the first one you can see is from the lipid web. So lipids are fatty acid and their derivatives and substances related either biosynthetically or functionally to those compounds. So this is kind of like a simple definition. So like any fatty acid and their derivatives, you can consider them to be a lipid. And another definition is from the lipid maps. So this is a little bit more kind of general. So lipids are hydrophobic or amphipathic small molecules that may originate entirely or in part by carbanion-based condensations of thiol esters. So for example, like fatty acids, and carb-cation-based condensations of isoprene units, so like sterols or prenols. So those two definitions are kind of, so personally, I kind of like the first one better because it's simpler, but the second one is more general. And it's also kind of a little bit more broad. It may suggest like biomolecules, if that's not a sugar or proteins or nucleotides, they are kind of like lipids. So this is a little bit more a general definition. You can pick whichever one you like. And I'm just showing you like on the right some example lipid structures here from those very common lipid classes. You will see those kind of lyso species over there, and some phospholipid down here in the middle, and the sphingolipids over here, and some glycerolipids. We'll go into those lipid structure later. So just some overview about lipids in general. So lipids are quite like it's a really diverse small molecule. If you think about its the structure, so you have fatty acids. They can be in different lengths. You have double bonds, like their localization can be different, and those fatty acid tails can be conjugated to either glycerol backbones or sphingosine bases. And you will have definitely various head group on your lipids. So think about this, also this combinatorial space. Lipid is definitely very diverse. And if you look at the complexity of lipids, so we can, it's also very kind of hierarchical. So you can go from the lipid category. So for example, a glycerol phospholipid, and then you go like deeper into the structure. So you have a lipid class, for example, like a PC, phosphatidylcholine. And then you have a species. So you add this fatty acid information here to this PC lipid. So you have like 34, for example, you can have 34 different carbons in your fatty acid tails and one double bond. So you have a PC34 1. And if you go deeper, you have a molecular species. For example, you kind of you figure out like what exactly the fatty acid tails are there, but you still don't know the SN positions. So you have like, for example, PC 16,0, 18,1. And then if you go deeper and deeper, you can have SN positions, double bond localization, etc. So for most of the work we are doing, and also I believe in the field, the for like this untargeted discovery method, a lot of people are kind of at the species and molecular species level. But if you combine some kind of fancy like mass spec technologies, you can get into definitely a more refined lipid structure to be able to figure out the SN position, double bond localization, like all those informations there. Okay, so this is a like a standard mass spec based lipidomics analysis workflow. So you will start with lipid extraction. So you just add some organic solvents here, and then you kind of load your lipid samples on your column, or you can do a direct infusion. So those can be either positive mode or a negative ion mode, and your lipids can be analyzed by the mass spectrometer you prefer, and then you can do the analysis. So this is quite straightforward, like nothing is really crazy here. So because in this lecture, I'm just going to focus on the chromatography part. So the kind of the key thing to have a good lipid identification and quantification is to have a good peak shape from your chromatography. So ideally, you would prefer to have some Gaussian like peaks from your chromatogram, and you really would like to avoid having some peak broadening or peak splitting or peak tailing. So if you have a really broad peak, which will definitely reduce your signal and also your sensitivity of measuring those lipid features. And if you have peak splitting happening, so sometimes it can cause some misidentification, and you will also have you won't really have some good quantification over here. And if the peak tailing happens, it's also really hard to have a good quantification, especially if you assume like if you are going to use some like data process software and you assume those peaks are Gaussian peaks, it will be really tricky to do that. So to have a like good peak shape for your lipid species, I'm just going to talk about 3 really common like LC method to do those lipidomics analysis to kind of help you have a better understanding and make decisions to kind of improve your chromatography and peak shapes for your lipidomics analysis. So I'm just showing you up here. So this is an example lipid species PC160182. Just kind of make a little bit cartoon over there. You have 2 fatty acyl tails and the lipid head group. Just to make the explanation a little bit easier. So for the 3 most commonly used LC method for the MS-based lipidomics, you have reversed phase liquid chromatography, so RPLC, normal phase liquid chromatography, NPLC, and hydrophilic interaction liquid chromatography, HILIC. So for the RPLC, reverse phase liquid chromatography, so you have stationary phase, which usually consists of silica microparticles. So usually it can be C8 or C18 or even C30 hydrocarbon chains in your stationary phase. And you can have different, also there, like you can have them functionized to have those like cyano or phenol or amino derivatives of those silica-based stationary phases. And your mobile phase is usually water miscible organic solvents. So you can have acetylnitrile, methanol, or isopropanol. So those are 3 like really commonly used like water miscible mobile phases for your reverse phase LC. The mechanism for separating lipids from doing RPLC is that it's mainly driven by this hydrophobic interaction of your lipids to the stationary phase. So your lipids will be loaded in a relatively polar or aqueous condition. And the hydrocarbon or the fatty acyl chains, they will be thermodynamically unfavored if they are exposed in the relatively aqueous condition. So they will be partitioned into the stationary phase by either absorption or even like fully engulfed into this the hydrocarbon chains of their stationary phase. And once you increase your organic content in the mobile phase, your lipids will be partitioned and released from your stationary phase and eluted off your column. And so this RPLC is, I would say it's the most commonly used LC method for lipids, probably over 70 or even 80% of the LC MS-based lipidomics, they are using this reverse phase method. And for NPLC, so it's kind of opposite as your RPLC method. So your stationary phase will be polar. It's also usually like silica or silica bound phases, and your mobile phase is usually like unpolar. So for example, like the common mobile phases you use for NPLC could be like hexene or heptene, and together with some like other miscible solvents like MTBE. And your lipids will be absorbed to the stationary phase of NPLC, mainly by this absorption of the head group. So you'll have this dipole-dipole interaction over here in your NPLC between your lipids to the stationary phase. And lipids usually are loaded in a more kind of organic condition. And when you increase your water, your make your mole phase more like less organic, your lipids can be eluted off your column. And for Hillic, it's similar to normal phase liquid chromatography. So your stationary phase will still be like silica or functionized silica, and your mole phase is usually a water miscible organic solvents. But the difference is that you will have a like thin aqueous layer on your stationary phase, so you can have partition between this aqueous thin layer to your mole phase organic layer. And the interaction in so using the Hillic method is kind of a little bit more complex. So you will definitely have some dipole-dipole interaction. You will have hydrogen bonding and also electrostatic interactions. So it's kind of also a combination of ion exchange chromatography there. But either by doing either NPLC or Hillic, your lipids will be eluted based on their head group polarity. But for RPLC, it's more about the fatty acyl tails. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about the RPLC method because it's mostly commonly used method, and it's definitely used a lot by our lab too. So again, it's still showing you on the left. This is a schematic diagram of the RPLC separation. So your stationary phase can be C8 or C13, C18 or C30 hydrocarbon chains in your mole phase. In your stationary phase. And if you really care about the like for example, your really hydrophilic lipid species, for example, those lysyl species, you probably can pick C8 columns. Or if you really care about your very hydrophobic lipid species like triglycerides, C80 could be an option to go. But the C18 column would still be kind of, if you don't have a preference, you just would like to do some like discovery on targeted lipidomics method, C18 would be the column that you would like to use. And your mole phase will be acetylnitrile, methanol, and isopropanol. And it's usually like 60 or 70% acetylnitrile with water, and the mole phase B is isopropanol. So you just kind of increase the mole phase A to mole phase B, you will elute your lipids off your column. And so for the you can definitely have different flow rate for this RPLC method, which depends on how big or how wide the column you use. For most of the people doing RPLC lipidomics, they will just do like high flow or microflow method. So you'll go with a column that has an inner diameter of at least 1 millimeter. But recently, this nanoflow lipidomics method is kind of gaining more attention. It's not really very new. Like people are doing it even like 10 years ago, but recently, like definitely more people like started to do this method, and we see an increase of publications like in recent years. So you can just use some capillary columns that's usually 25 to 100 micron inner diameter, and you can load a lot less materials, will have a boost in the sensitivity and also in the end the number of identifications. Okay, so what I'm showing you here is an example chromatogram from the high flow LC-MS data. So this is from human plasma, and the column here I'm showing you is a reverse phase C18 BEH column with an inner diameter of 2.1 millimeter. So the LC I use here is a thermal vanquish system. So the mole phase A is 70% acetonitrile or 70% ACN. Mole phase B consists of isopropanol to ACN at a ratio of 9:1. So we also have some mole phase modifiers here. So that's 0.025% acetic acid and 10 millimolar ammonium acetate. So just to boost the ionization of our lipid once it got eluded from the column and ionized by ESI. And since we are using a 2.1 millimeter inner diameter column, so flow rate is high. It's like 0.4 milliliter per minute, and we use a Orbitrap based Q-exactive HF for like to collect those data. So this example chromatogram, this example data were collected in either in both a positive ion mode and negative ion mode. And since this is a reverse phase method, so you can see here at the beginning, we have those lysyl species and isocarnitines eluted. And then in the middle, we have cholesterol phospholipid and sphingolipids. And in the end, you have those really hydrophobic glycerolipid and sterolipids. What I'm showing you in this slides are the data we collected when doing nanoflow LC-MS method. So this is using a very narrow capillary column. So it is still the same stationary phase, so the reverse phase C18 BH column. But the inner diameter of the column is only 75 micron inner diameter, compared to the previous 2.1 millimeter. So the LC we used to collect this data was a thermal ultimus resolvent, and the mole phase A is 60% ACN. Mole phase B is again IPA to ACN 9:1. And we have formic acid and ammonium formate as our mole phase modifiers. So flow rate, you can see here, is definitely a lot lower. It's only like 0.2 microliter per minute. And the mass spectrometer we use here is also the Q-exactive HF. Again, so this is a reverse phase method. So you'll see the you still have your lysyl species over here at the beginning, and your glycerol phospholipid and sphingolipid in the middle, and then at the end you'll have your sterolipid and the glycerolipid. So if you look at the chromatogram from a high flow system and a nanoflow system, so showing you to the left and in the middle. This is also from positive ion mode and negative ion mode. And this is the same sample we run on the same mass spectrometer, but just use a different type of LC, different from high flow and nanoflow. So you can tell definitely if you can go from high flow to nanoflow, you can resolve like much more chromatographic peaks over there, and you can observe increase in almost all of the lipid classes. I mean, for the number of identifications. So one thing that is important is that you really have to kind of make sure a system is clean. I think this is true for both of your high flow system and also your nanoflow system. And especially for nanoflow, because it's more sensitive, just a little tiny bit of contaminant stuff in your column will create really intense signal. So you can see here, if you are not being really careful about what you are putting in your system, just by injecting a blank, like a water blank to your column, you will have a chromatogram like this. So this will make things really hard. It's just like hard to tell, like if those are really lipids or that's from something else. And once you make sure the system is clean, you'll have definitely a very nice looking blank over here. So this is one of the critical things to be considered, especially for nanoflow. And another thing that is also very important is risk suspension solvent you use. This is also true for both high flow and nanoflow. The example like peaks I showed you here is from nanoflow data. So this ACA and IP water mixture is our typical lipid risk suspension solvent for the high flow system. And we usually will have good peak shapes from when using this risk suspension solvent. But when switching to nanoflow, you can tell, especially for the hydrophilic lipid species, it's lyso-PC and lyso-PE, your peak shape is suffered from doing this a little bit more organic condition. And once you increase your organic content from this imbuno IPA water risk suspension solvent, you start to have some peak splitting for your like very hydrophilic lipid species here. So this is just something to think about when you are doing your reverse phase method. It will be a good practice to test your risk suspension solvent with maybe some lipid standard. So we usually just use some splash mixture from Avanti lipids, and this is kind of, you have some hydrophilic lipid species here, like this lyso-PC and lyso-PE, and some glycerophospholipid and sphingolipid, and some very hydrophobic cholesterol and triglycerides. So it will be a good practice to kind of test before you start to analyze your real sample, just to see what the peak shape look like by running the lipid, like simple lipid standard mixtures on your column. And although the normal phase and helic is not what our lab is typically using for our work, but it's still, like, some people are doing those methods, and this method can be good if you want to do some deeper like comprehensive profiling method. So this can be some orthogonal method you choose. So just to show you two example chromatogram by running NPLC and helic. So you can see clearly the lipids are more separated based on the class or the head group. So you'll have more hydrophobic lipids elute earlier. So you can see the triglycerides, diglyceride at the beginning, and then you will have your phospholipid like PC, PE, sphingomyelin at the end. So that's also the same for helic. Okay, so this is what it really looks like in your LC method. So just still, I'm showing you the example of our RPLC. So the column will be a reverse phase C18 column, 2.1 millimeter ID. So mole phase A typically is 70% acetonitrile, and your mole phase B is typically IPA to ACN at a ratio of 9:1 or 90:10. And you just so our lab typically is doing a 30-minute method to for separation of your of the lipid samples. So you will start with 2% B, and then your lyso species usually will elute over there at the beginning, and then you quickly increase your move phase to 30%, and then 50%. So that's when you'll start to see your glycerol phospholipid and sphingolipid, and then you increase the move phase B percentage to 85, and that's when you will start to see your triglycerides, like the glycerol lipid species. And then you increase your move phase B percent to 99 to just clean up your column, and you go back to 2% B to re-equilibrate your column. So this is a typical method we use for our high flow RPLC method. And once you have your lipid elute, you will just ionize your lipid, typically by electrospray ionization, and your lipids will be analyzed by the downstream MS. So this is what I want to share with you, and I think Dain will talk a little bit more about the data acquisition part.
Yuchen gave a great summary on kind of the separation techniques that we use in the Kuhn lab regarding our lipidomics workflows. And I kind of want to start off, before I dive too deeply into our MS acquisition strategies, and to kind of retouch on some of the subjects that Yuchen had brushed upon, what exactly is a lipid and what are the different parts of it. So this is just a standard lipid species that you might see in a lot of biological samples of phosphatidylcholine with 70181, or shorthand notation, you might see it listed as PC35-1 at the species level. And you can kind of break down lipids. They're in this interesting middle ground between peptides and metabolites, where there is some conserved structure between all these lipid species, that so you can kind of algorithmically determine fragmentation patterns for individual lipid classes, compared to just running standards that you might do for like a metabolomics assay. So in this case, I would take a look at this PC species, and I would break it down into having this functional head group, a phosphatidylcholine head group, a glycerol backbone, and that would have these acyl chain constituents, and kind of these three segments are what we would be looking for characterization in a mass spectrometry assay. And depending on what activation type you use, kind of what Yuchen had touched upon, you'll have fragmentation happen at different locations on this lipid species, dependent on lipid class, the individual physiochemical properties, and even dependent on lipid chain length. So for collisional activation methods, collisional fragmentation, that's very common on many different types of mass spectrometers, not just Thermo Fisher Scientific platforms. We'll typically see, depending on the ionization polarity that you use, we'll see fragmentation at where the fatty acyl chains bind to the glycerol backbone, or you'll see fragmentation at the head group. And the charge might stick on one side or the other of that fragmentation kind of site. But that's where we see fragmentation pattern, the fragmentation happen. And depending on when you generate these fragmentation, these spectra, you take these MS2s, you can get, like Yuchen mentioned, different levels of structural specificity. So I'll go over this more briefly than I would have previously, as Yuchen kind of touched upon this idea already. But really what we're considering for the most part with collisional activation techniques with mass spectrometry technologies is we typically report out identifications at the species level, where you have that sum composition of carbons and double bond equivalents, molecular species level, where you know the acyl chain constituents, but not how they're attached to the kind of glycerol backbone. That slide. And finally, SN isomeric forms, which you can tease out if you have really good modeling and you're very confident in your separation, but we tend to stay away from this level of structural kind of resolution, as we're not always certain that we have pure SN isomeric forms during our reverse phase separations. You can also get carbon-carbon double bond localization and even bond geometry using techniques such as UVPD, but we haven't dabbled too much with that technology in the Kuhn lab as of yet. Like Yuchen had mentioned, one of our kind of workhorses of a lipidomics mass spectrometry platform is the Q-Exactive or the Q-Exactive HF. So your lipids, you ionize them after separation, they're introduced, they go around a bent flatopole to filter out neutrals, and they go through a quadrupole for optional mass selection. And their ions are stored in the C-trap, where you then shuttle them either into the HCD collision cell for fragmentation, or you send them to the orbitrap for mass analysis. And to kind of talk about the acquisition scan cycle for the Q-Exactive, typically what you do as your lipids are eluting at any point in time, you would collect a survey scan to see what intact precursors or adducted lipid species are coming off your column at a particular point in time. So you collect kind of that survey scan, and then you rank those precursors from most intense to least intense, and you sample kind of going down that ladder, each of those precursors until you run out of either time, or you sample the number of precursors that you've set beforehand on your instrument method. And you kind of just rinse and repeat. And each of these cycles that are shown here, this figure is adapted from the manuscript cited below. You could do a single polarity, so positive mode or negative mode, or you can alternate polarities on this particular platform if you so wish to improve your depth and kind of get more lipid species over your entire analysis. Lipid fragmentation behaviors are incredibly class dependent, as I kind of touched on briefly in my introductory slides. So if we take, instead of a PC, this case of a PC is a deuterated standard obtained from Avanti polar lipids and expanded upon stable isotope labeled standard collection called Ultimate Splash. There's about 70 standards spanning 13 lipid classes in this set. But if you do in the positive ion mode, collisional activation, so beam type CID or CAD in the ion rounding multipole on a Q-Exactive or a tribrid. Typically what you would see in a an MS2 after collection is you would see this really prominent ion at 184, which corresponds to the charge carrying head group of a phosphatidylcholine species. And that information from the spectra is enough to typically report out identifications at the species level, where you know some composition of this particular species for phosphatidylcholines. So if you want additional structural information, you have to integrate a supplemental analysis. So commonly, the most common form of supplemental analysis is using an alternate polarity, either with separate injections, so negative mode ionization. So you would either do a separate injection or you do polarity switching, sample the same precursor or the same, neutral precursor. And for the negative mode fragmentation spectra here, you get acyl chain fragmentation, or acyl chain information. You can pair those two parts together and you can get basically this molecular species level ID, where you know the acyl chain constituents, you know the head group, and you're pretty confident that this is the species that you see, especially since this is a deuterated standard. Now, another one of the mass spectrometry platforms that we use in the Kuhn lab is for lipidomics is the Orbitrap Eclipse Tribrid MS, or the Orbitrap Ascend Tribrid MS. So shown here is this instrument schematic for the Orbitrap Eclipse, where there's some similarities to the Q-Exactive, except on the back end, you have the a linear ion trap slapped on. So this has some benefits, and mainly you have both the Orbitrap mass analyzer and you have the linear trap mass analyzer. In the Orbitrap mass analyzer, you have the advantages of having high resolution and high mass accuracy. It comes at a cost of its scans a little bit slower, especially when you're using particularly high resolution resolving powers. But with this particular instrument configuration and having the ion trap in the back end, you can parallelize. So as you're collecting high resolution MS1, so you can tease out precursors better, during your survey scans, you can collect MS2s in parallel to that MS1 being acquired in the linear ion trap. And the linear ion trap scans very, very quickly. And it also has improved sensitivity in comparison to the Orbitrap mass analyzer, but it comes at a cost of lower mass accuracy and lower mass resolution. And Katie was kind enough to share a link to the nanolipidomics manuscript that Yuchen have been kind of talking about previously. I'm also referencing it here. Yuchen had done a lot of really cool work along with Katie on kind of exploring how we can get deeper into the lipidome and use this linear ion trap to sample more precursors across our analysis. And if I went down and I took some lipids extracted from this 1950 plasma, what I would see is, over our analysis, we'd collect about 100,000 spectra. And then after all of our data processing, result filtering, and everything all said and done, we're only reporting out about somewhere between, depending on how good your chromatography is and how good the instrument is performing, somewhere between 800 to 1300 lipid species. So in this particular case, I got about 900 lipid identifications annotated using our in-house software Lipidex. And then if you take a look at kind of like the structural resolution of those identifications, we're only getting about 120 at the molecular species level. So if you think about batting averages, we're acquiring a lot of spectra, but we're not necessarily converting to identifications, and we're leaving information on the table with that extra time. So we kind of sat down and thought, hey, are there other basically mid-acquisition approaches that we could use to improve the structural resolution of our identifications kind of as we're acquiring data? And we can, so one of the approaches that we can use, instead of using polarity switching or separate polarity injections, which come at a cost of either doubling your analysis time if you use separate injections, or essentially having your duty cycle if you're doing polarity switching, because you spend half time in one polarity, half time in another. You can instead use complementary collisional activation. So on the Tribrid platform, you can use resonance type collisional activation in the linear ion trap, and it's labeled mostly as CID. So if we take this, PC standard, as I've kind of referred to previously, and you do, once again, HCD activation, so beam type collisional activation, you see really mainly this 184 ion. Now, if you do collisional resonance type collisional activation in the ion trap instead, same polarity, you actually do C fragment ions corresponding to these, acyl chains in the acyl chain composition. So we sat down and thought, hey, what other lipid classes can we kind of approach and use the same kind of idea? So we took this stable isotope labeled standard collection from Avanti Polar Lipids called Ultimate Splash, and we basically applied different series of MSN activation on these lipid standards to see, hey, what lipid classes are we typically reporting out at some composition or species level identifications? And is there any sort of MSN kind of protocol that we can follow, or an MSN tree that we could implement that we could recover that structural information? Let's see, how am I doing on time? Running out of time, Katie? Or do I have half an hour still? Still good. Okay, perfect. So, we sat down, we did that, and I'm gonna first kind of highlight this PE species. So PEs are lipid class that are known to preferentially ionize in negative mode, but we still do see them in positive mode, and we typically will get some identifications out at the molecular species level. We'll know the acyl chain constituents, but most of the IDs that we report out are at the species level or some composition. So typically what we see when we collect a HCD, do HCD fragmentation, we collect an MS2, is we see a really large, let's see if I can get my pointer up. Laser pointer, here we go. We typically see a large peak corresponding to head group neutral loss. We see relatively low abundant fragment ions corresponding to acyl chain neutral losses or fragments. And then we see kind of this between 80 or so mass charge to about 200 is this ion series that corresponds to fragments of fragmentation of the acyl chains themselves, which aren't necessarily, they can be structurally informative, but they're very difficult to tease out information. So typically, if we got this spectra from a complex mixture, we would be able to report out this identification at the molecular species level. But one thing that you have to consider as well is due to the prevalence of isobars and co-isolation of other lipid species is your spectral matching can get convoluted a little bit, and it can become very difficult to reliably and confidently tease out this information. So what we can do is, hey, what if we try for the same thing that we did with PCs, do CID activation at the MS2 level of the intact precursor, and really the only thing that you generate is this head group neutral loss peak, which doesn't help you. But if you instead do a CID activated MS3 on that neutral loss peak, head group neutral loss peak, you can then recover, once again, that structural information on the fly. And this kind of fragmentation tree applies to other glycerophospholipid species. So other anionic, typically considered anionic lipid species. You do see intact precursors in positive mode. But again, these are usually reported out at the species level as an identification when we're doing positive mode analysis. So, once again, do HCD activation of all these different lipid species. So they're all different head groups, same acyl chain constituents. So they all mainly lose their head group, and that's the most prevalent ion after doing HCD activation. But once again, you can do CID activation, and the spectral look, despite being completely different lipid classes, once you lose that head group, they all fragment incredibly similarly at the MS3 level. So we can kind of sit there and kind of call that like a MSN tree for glycerophospholipids. So it's kind of a set of rules that we can improve structural identification and characterization for these particular classes. And the final lipid class that I want to cover today that we've derived these MSN rules for are sphingomyelins. And sphingomyelins are notoriously difficult to characterize. They're almost always reported out in literature at the species level or some composition. So similar to PC lipids, sphingomyelins have a phosphocholine head group, which is a charge carrier. So in the positive ion mode, when you do collisional activation, you pop off that head group as the charge carrier. And since there's 9 deuterium slapped on top of this particular standard on the head group, the characteristic ion that you see here is 193 instead of 184, but same fragmentation pattern as PC lipids. But if you do, similar to PC lipids, if you do CID activation, we do see different fragmentation pattern. We don't see that phosphocholine head group ion. Instead, we see a series of neutral losses that are very characteristic for sphingomyelins. So we see a water loss, a loss of part of the head group in water, and then a loss of the entire head group in water. Now, that doesn't necessarily give you more structural information. It's just, different parts of the head group. Cool. But if you do, once again, serial activation, CID, MS3 of either of the neutral loss, head group neutral loss peaks, either this one or this one, what you end up generating is a fragment ion at 264 for this particular sphingomyelin backbone fragment. That allows you to report out sphingomyelins now at the SN positional isomer level, which is fantastic. It's super cool. And we're really excited about that work. So we sat down and said, hey, what can we do? Can we actually apply this method to complex mixtures? So I forgot about this slide. This is basically a more infographic style of like, what's the fragmentation tree for this particular lipid species? So serial activation. So one of the ways that you can trigger kind of these MSN trees on the fly is you look for characteristic fragmentation patterns. It's something that's built in on any of the Thermo Fisher orbit trap platforms that we use, so the QEs or the tribrids. So typically what we do, this is kind of a cartoonized version of our data acquisition protocol, but you collect your survey scan, you see what precursors are eluting at any point in time. You do your MS2, typically using HCD because it's a little bit faster than CID, and the Q exactives only can do HCD fragmentation. And then you take a look for that 184 ion, or you take a look for those characteristic neutral losses, and then you can use those characteristic fragmentation patterns to kind of trigger different branches of this decision tree, essentially. And what we see is when you're triggering these additional MSN, if you're just doing a typical DDA workflow where you're not triggering any MSN, you're, again, collecting about 100,000 spectra. But once you start triggering these MSN, it takes extra time to, do the supplemental activation, and it slows down your analysis. Or it slows down your sampling of unique precursors, but it comes with the benefit that you do annotate more lipid species at the molecular species level or better. But on the other hand, since some of these characteristic fragment ions are pervasive throughout your entire gradient, what ends up happening is you're triggering all these MSN constantly, and you're not necessarily going to convert these MSN into improved identifications. So shown here is kind of like a rough histogram of where you're triggering MSN across your gradient. You see that, ideally we'd be triggering all these MSN around this elution profile of your glycerophospholipids. And we see really there's more of a peak between 20 and 25 minutes, and just happens across the entire gradient. So you're wasting sampling capacity doing supplemental analysis where it's not going to help you. And it comes at a cost of you end up reporting out fewer lipid identifications at the end of your analysis. So if you really care about structural information, additional structural information, and you only want to use a single polarity, this is definitely a method that you can use. But it does hurt your total number of lipid identifications at the end of the day. So if only there was a method that we could use to more selectively trigger MSN. And here's where real-time library search can come in. So real-time library search is a new technology on the newer generations of Tribrids, Orbitrap Tribrid platforms. So the Eclipse, the IQX, and the Orbitrap Ascend, that allows you to search your acquired spectra on the fly. So you can kind of think about the Tribrids acquisition cycle. You collect your MS1, you start acquiring your MS2s. What real-time library search allows you to do is, as the second you acquire that MS2, it's shipped off back to the instrument computer, and it's searched against the spectral library that you've pre-configured. And you can essentially do spectral matching, and you can get a proposed lipid identification out on the fly. And depending on that lipid identification, so we kind of derive those use cases where we need it, we would like to improve structural resolution. You can say, hey, this looks like a lipid that could have improved structural identification. So you do this spectral scoring, and that information is then passed back. And if you pass these score thresholds that we've derived, you can then inject class-targeted MSN following those same decision branches that we've done previously with characteristic ions. Instead, do it on lipid identifications. And this comes at a benefit of it's capable of doing spectral matches on the LC timescale. So Will Barshop and the Jesse Canterbury, Brandon Bills, and the rest of the Thermo team have done some really cool optimization on their end of doing, they made the searches intelligently indexed so that you can do the searches in the LC timescale. So you can do adduct indirect searches. So if you have a particular master charge, you don't know what the lipid adduct is, you can search for multiple precursors at the same time, which is really, really cool. And those search results will usually return back a proposed lipid identification faster than the instrument can finish acquiring the next spectra. So you don't kind of build up this queue of, we got to sample all these things, we're running out of time. The instrument's able to keep up. So as using kind of a precursor mass tolerance when we're doing our spectral library searching as a standard for search space, you can bump up, your precursor mass tolerance to like something absolutely ludicrous, like 500 ppm. And the majority of your searches are still going to fall, return back identifications before your next ion trap scan has finished acquisition. And typically you use 5 ppm or 10 ppm as a precursor mass tolerance. So like, it would be ridiculous to use 500 ppm. But you could do it if you wanted. So to kind of go back to this cartoonized decision tree. So instead of using characteristic ions, we're now using real-time library search nodes after you collect your initial MS2, and we're doing a second search as well to try and suss out additional sphingomyelin species using that kind of characteristic neutral loss pattern that I described previously. And some things that you need to provide for, let's see, I'm doing it time, perfect. some things that you need to provide to do spectral library searching on these newer generations of tribrids is you need to have previously configured a spectral library using Thermo Fisher's MZ Vault software. And usually you can take your spectral libraries that you might have in-house that are in mass bank or MSP format, which are pretty common. And you can import those directly into MZ Vault. Otherwise, you can upload a raw file and annotate, add the identifications yourself directly. You also need to specify a precursor mass charge tolerance, collision energy tolerance. So there's all these additional filtering steps that you can leverage in that allows you to be more selective than just looking for the presence or absence of a particular fragment ion that you would have used previously. So just to kind of give an example of what this would look like on the fly and kind of how the instrument decides where it goes on this decision tree. So if we're doing a running a complex sample and you're just acquiring MSN or MS2s, MS1, MS2s, MS1, MS2s, and then all of a sudden you sample this particular precursor 25 minutes or so, and you see this 184 ion, that spectra will be sent off to the real-time library search service, and it'll say, hey, this is 184, the precursor mass charge matches a sphingomyelin species, so it'll trigger this CID MS2 here. It'll then go back, sample the same precursor and do supplemental activation using CID, and you'll see this, once again, this kind of characteristic neutral loss pattern. And this spectral will then once again be sent back to the real-time library search service for a second round of searching. And if this passes score thresholds, which it does, let's see, yeah, there we go. You trigger that supplemental MS3. And this particular case, what we see from this complex, these are lipids extracted from NIS 1950 plasma. We do see at this particular point that you have two co-eluding isobaric sphingomyelin species. So this D181220 and this sphingomyelin D161240, which is something that you couldn't do previously. And you just lump these two identifications back into one one identification. But now we have additional information we can use to split out this particular peak, potentially into two different identifications. So we were curious to see, using kind of this real-time library search approach, and how does that compare to other typically used analysis analytical approaches used in the Kuhn lab. So just doing typical DDA in positive mode, negative mode, polarity switching, or triggering on characteristic ions. The rest of the data shown in this slide deck was acquired on the newest generation of Orbitrap tribrids, so it's the Ascend. Really, the main difference is it has a ion routing multipole in the front, so it can do HCD fragmentation faster, and it has some improvements to electronics, so it can scan quicker, and it's also more sensitive. But if we take a look again at the kind of a number of acquired spectra, each time we inject a sample and do a 60-minute analysis, what we see is if you're doing single polarity analyses, so positive mode, negative mode, just DDA, you collect the most spectra. So you're getting 100,000. If you're triggering MSN, which takes additional time, you slow down a little bit more. And we're seeing about the same speed decrease from both our RTLS and our trigger on characteristic ion methods. Polarity switching has so much overhead while you wait for electronics to settle that you're only collecting about 200,000, or what is it, 200,000, 20,000 to 30,000 spectra per analysis for the ion trap data. But if you take a look at those targeted lipid classes, so PCs, PIs, PGs, PIs, PSs, FSMs, and you take a look at the lipid identifications reported out at the molecular species level, we see that negative mode, just a single polarity, gives you the most number of molecular species level IDs just for these lipid classes. But we're pretty close for triggering, supplemental MSN. We're talking about 10 or so identifications. And we see that if you're running a polarity switching mode, if you integrate RTLS into that acquisition instead of just doing DDA, you get a slight boost in your identifications as well. We see improved selectivity when we're triggering MSN, not necessarily for PCs and sphingomyelins. You still see kind of this trend where you're sampling PC or SM-like species across and triggering MSN across the gradient, but it's less pronounced as, you know, just triggering off on 184. But you also see that you do a better, more selective job triggering on sphingomyelins for your CID MS3s. Same thing with for your glycerophospholipids. You're much more selective and you're triggering where those species are actually eluting. And because you're more selective, what we do end up seeing in this final panel here is, you know, while you're not acquiring as many spectra, you are reporting out more identifications at the end of the day using just a single polarity for RTLS, using RTLS kind of MSN triggering, and you also get the benefits of you know, improved structural characterization compared to polarity switching or, you know, running negative mode. That being said, if you wanted the best, you know, lipidomics data and you want to get as deep as you could, what you would want to do is still probably separate polarity injections because you have basically twice the analysis time. But if you kind of want to strike this Goldilocks principle, you might want to consider, you know, running either in polarity switching or using these kind of supplemental activation approaches, either on diagnostic fragmentation patterns or using real-time library search if you do have a newer generation of the Tribrid platform. It allows you to kind of strike this balance of getting deeper structural resolution while maintaining your level of lipid identifications. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dain, and thank you, Yuchen. As you guys have probably noticed, this is highlighting a lot of our current work, and Dain's label there is data unpublished, but we're nearing the last bit of review or round of revisions for Dain's manuscript on real-time library searching, and so expect that paper to come out from our lab here pretty soon. I imagine in the next month or two. Yeah, hopefully. But obviously we'll give you guys the methods to be able to start implementing that on your end as you'd like. We do have a question here in the chat, and so we'll start with that one, but as people have questions, feel free to either raise your hand or put it in the chat and then we'll get to you. I'm not going to pronounce your name correct here, but Haiyan Tan, would you like to address your question? Gonna unmute.
Hi, yes, thank you. This is Haiyan from St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. So my question for Yuchen is, if the background blank run is not clean, so what is usually procedure to make it clean? So sometimes I found it's very hard.
Yeah, so there's kind of multiple aspects to kind of improve the cleanness of your LC-MS run. So first, you got to make sure your system is really clean, and the most important thing is to have a very clean mole phase and a bottle that contains your mole phase. So especially, I think it probably wouldn't matter a lot for the high flow reverse phase setup, but especially for nano, what we typically do to clean our mole phase bottles to kind of use detergents like Alkanox, sonicate it for 15 minutes, and then we sonicate the bottles again with 50% methanol for another 15 minutes, and then rinse our bottle with pure methanol. Like all solvents use that are mass spec, LC-MS grade. And another thing is that so when you are doing your sample prep, your extraction, it will be good practice to kind of trying to like trying like avoid using plastics, but sometimes it's hard to do, especially if you have like really large amount of samples to prepare. So you gotta kind of make some compromise here. But at least for us, the most important part is on the LCMS part. So you gotta really make sure your LC is clean. So use LCMS grade solvents, clean your bottle, and once you have a clean mold phase, just kind of flush your system for a while, and then you should be good to go.
Great, thank you so much.
Mhm.
Can I have ask another question?
Mhm.
Oh, so this is for Dain. For the lipid identification, what's library? Do you use in-house library or in silico library or? Can you hear me?
Dain is not in the thing right now.
Oh, maybe a person from your group can answer the question, I think.
Yeah, so we use an in silico library that is based off of fragmentation patterns that are seen, as Dain explained, the head
Mhm.
group
But I
and the
can't-
acyl chains. Yeah.
But you report a number only like not very few, not a lot. Is that because if you use in silico library, usually I feel like I can identify more than that number.
More than 850?
Yeah, use in silico without a retention time match.
I see.
Uh,
So I think we're going to get into that a little bit in tomorrow's sessions. Some
so
of the caveats with a lot of lipidomics processing tools is accounting for things like in-source fragmentation and adducts. So our
So-
software tool does collapse those down.
okay, so I'm still kind of new for the field. So my question is, if without the RT match, is the lipidomic data publishable?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I think a lot of the field uses spectral quality, and so you do need to have some metric of what is a good spectral match
Yeah,
to
some
your
group
library.
I saw they use the RT prediction to kind of match those kind of parameters.
And I think that can help. We haven't delved in that with any of the tools that we're going to be explaining today. Besides
Okay.
the real-time library searching, we do use retention time to prevent some of the searching and trigger events in regions where we don't expect those lipids. But otherwise, we don't use retention time in our processing.
Great, thank you for giving me the opportunity to ask. Thank you.
Thanks. We have another question for Jana. Hope I'm pronouncing that correct. Feel free to ask.
Yes. Thank you. Yeah, really fantastic work, beautiful presentation, and thank you for putting all this together. Very basic question. Where do you or have you found a source for sort of standard mixture of lipids? For example, there is ultimate splash, but of course they are not naturally occurring. So is there an equivalent that is naturally occurring that one can buy and build up a library on? Or do you usually just build your library on your favorite cell line / tissue, etc.?
So I guess I can field that one. So our original Lipidex library was built off of both old standards were purchased, came in individual standard compounds. Avanti also has those available. Lipidizer mixture is one, I believe is SciX. And those were used to build out our initial fragmentation rules, in addition to having lysates of human cell lines, and those were analyzed extensively too. That work is described in our Lipidex paper, and also our library forge paper that I can put a link to here once I'm done talking. There is a tool within our software infrastructure, Lipidex, and we'll dig that into a little bit more tomorrow, but the Lipidex platform has a Library Forge tab. And with Library Forge, it takes in your expected lipids of interest and tries to derive rules from your real data. And it is quite manual, but it is a way to facilitate building out your libraries based on your data and your samples that you have in-house. I think library building is actually quite challenging, and we do have a session a bit about that on the end of tomorrow on how to build out libraries, how to start thinking about building out libraries. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very, very, very useful.
Yep. Lydia, I see that you have your hand raised.
Yeah, great talks, both of you. I have a question, I guess, aimed at Dain. You mentioned that the library searching can be done on like an LC timescale. So I was just wondering, what is your peak width or average peak width?
Let's see, I'm muted. Average peak width, it's been a while since I've looked at this, so my memory's a little bit rusty. I would throw out, and Katie, please chime in if this sounds ludicrous, like 15 to 20 seconds. Does that sound reasonable? Or is it shorter? Narrower?
I believe
10,
it's narrower.
10 seconds maybe?
About 10 seconds is our sort of average.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And Molly, I see you have your hand raised.
I have a question about kind of doing nanoflow. I assume, but I'm not sure, do you guys have like separate nanoflow systems that you use for proteomics versus your lipidomics?
Well, this is an interesting question. So we're kind of doing the we have two types of LCs to do that. So we can do it either using a separate LC to do just our lipidomics, but we can also do it kind of with our proteomics like together. So we recently just have had a paper about the multi-omic single shot technology. So we kind of use like so just very briefly, just like proteomics move is A with lipidomics move is B. So we were able to kind of do this integrated proteome and lipidome analysis kind of together using this single shot method from a single column and a single LC-MS run. And using that LC, if you don't care about proteomics or peptides at all, you can just start with a little bit higher percentage of B and still use that LC to do your lipidomics. So yes, you can do it. We are doing them like in both ways, and you can do it also that way
Okay,
too.
thank you.
Yep.